some of you already know that this is condo law is coming down the line, that we're all going to have to face it. It's already started with some of the deadlines. So I am Melissa Carbonell. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am not an attorney. This is not legal advice. I am not a licensed engineer. I am not a licensed architect. I am not a licensed CAM. But what I am is I used to have an independent brokerage. Now I'm with a bigger company, broker associate. I had a mortgage company in '98. I know how to read tax returns, and I was president on the board here where I own my office condo. And we went through 3 major construction projects with engineers, multiple contractors. So I do understand tenure reserve studies. I do understand what these major components of condos mean, and the costs and reserves and budgeting and financials. So I'm here just to kind of I continue to put the word out, not only for agents, but for buyers and for sellers. Sellers have some obligations right now for disclosure that they're probably not even aware of yet. And buyers need to be able to analyze properties. If their realtor hasn't done it, hopefully the realtors will start doing it and looking at the properties. I mean, we're just going to make estimations on whether these properties have moved along. So let's talk about a little bit about why the law is. I'll share my screen and we'll get into hang on one second. When you make things smaller, now I can't. All right, we're gonna share that. All right, there we go. So everybody can see my screen, right? Thumbs up, whatever. All right. And so here we go. So we're here because we know that it's going to get expensive in 2025. We're going to talk a little bit about that more in detail, and where these expenses are coming from and what the differences are going to be. So how did we get here? So why did state of Florida all of a sudden decide that they are going to regulate inspections and reserves and everything else that has to do with condominiums? So what happened is this. This is what motivated our legislature and our commissioners to take action, because prior to the Surfside tragedy, only Broward County and Miami had 40 and 50-year inspection requirements. The rest of the state did not. Now, we do have the largest concentration and of oldest condominium buildings, so it makes sense that we had those. But the state stepped in and said, no more, we're not going to take any chances. We need to make sure that residents and owners are safe. And so that's why the Senate Bill 4D was created. And it's well-intentioned. What they did is actually a good thing. And at the end of the day, it will be a good thing. I'm not bashing it in any way other than the timeline. The timeline is what's going to get really tricky and what can make it expensive. So, and that's why Senate Bill 4D was created. So that's what brought us to this point. And we're going to talk about the details and the deadlines and the inspections and the reserve requirements and how it affects condo owners right now. So what buildings are affected by this legislation? So if you are in a building that is 2 stories or lower, no matter how close it is to the coastline, this will not affect you. It does not affect those buildings. So 2 stories or lower. So one stories and 2 stories, you don't have to worry about this. This is all for buildings that are 3 stories and higher. If they're within 3 miles of the coastline, it's when they're 25 years or older. And if they're further than 3 miles of the coastline, it's 30 years or older. So that's it. You know, basically, what you're going to see and what I think is going to happen is you're going to see a lot of people moving out of the taller buildings who know they can't afford what's coming down the line and moving into these 1 and 2 story units. And they're going to start to be in high demand, even more than they are right now. So deadlines. So there's some really important deadlines in this Senate bill. So January 1st, all the condominium associations across the state of Florida had to report to the Division of Florida Condominiums. They had to report the height of their building, whether they were 2 stories or 30 stories or whatever they are, how many units they have, and more details. So the Division of Florida is starting to create a database of these buildings, and it's, you know, it's going to probably take them some time to get all of the data in there and out to the people, but we should be able to eventually search their database for condominiums that are X amount of years old, that are X amount of stories, that have done this inspection or that inspection, or up to date on this and that. I think that's the end game on this, but we'll see where they're going with collecting all of this data. So that's already passed. So that was as of January 1. And I don't know if the website is available yet. The last time I checked, it wasn't. So we'll have to just keep an eye out on that one. So one of the main deadlines for one of the big inspections is the phase 1 inspection. The phase 1 inspection is a visual walkthrough of an engineer, so or architect, depending on what they're looking at. So they will walk the property. We're not talking about doing a drive-by. They walk the property, they take an analysis. They look at, okay, do they see moisture issues? Do they see concrete spalling? Do they see waterproofing issues? Do they see cracks in the foundation, seawater rise? So they're walking through the property, doing a visual inspection, and they're going to basically say whether they need to move it to the phase 2 inspection because they see things that need to be addressed, or if they can move on and, you know, they've already been keeping up with their concrete restoration, their plumbing, their electrical, their roof, and all of their major components, and then they won't have to move to a phase 2 inspection. These phase 1 inspections, I'm not sure, the law isn't really clear, or maybe I just don't have an understanding of it, is if they do the phase 1 inspection and they have some issues, then they have to go to the phase 2 inspection. Now, I would assume that the deadline for all of those is going to be 12/31/2024. So phase 1 inspections probably need to be completed this year, because the deadline for all of these inspections is 2024. But what I would think is, let's say you did your phase 1 inspection November of 2024. Let's say the building did that. How are they going to get their phase 2 inspection done in time? Because right now we're dealing with a numbers problem. Basically, over 20,000 condominium buildings that are affected by this law, that there are only so many qualified inspectors to do these inspections. So that are licensed engineers and architects that can do these inspections. So we're dealing with that too. So most buildings, we want to know that they're scheduling, or they've scheduled, or they've done their phase 1 inspection within 2023. So that way they have time if they have to go to a phase 2 in 2024. All right, so yes, so right, so let's say the engineer walks through, he sees a bunch of cracks, he sees all these things, and that's when you wind up going into your phase 2 inspection. We talked about the critical deadline, so December 31st, 2024, that's when not only do phase 1, phase 2, if necessary, have to be completed. You're going to see this deadline come up a lot. It's going to come up next when we're talking about the structural integrity study. So, structural integrity reserve study. If you're familiar with selling condominiums, then you know, or you've owned a condominium, or you've been on the board of one, you know that they have to do 10-year reserve studies. 10-year reserve studies were always previously done by third-party companies that didn't have any special licensing. They didn't have a license that was on the line for what they were reporting. They could have had architects working for them. They could have had engineers working for them, but it wasn't required. Well, SB4D says now it's required. It has to be done by a licensed engineer or architect. And this is the part that's going to make things expensive. And I'll explain how it works and why it affects everything. So 10-year reserve studies are how buildings base their budgets. So if the roof has 5 years left on it, then you know that the roof is going to have to be replaced in 5 years, and that has to go into their budgeting so that they are prepared to pay for that roof whenever it's finished. So 10-year reserve studies tell the building what can be expected for the next 10 years for maintenance and for repairs and for replacement. And that's what they have to budget for. All right, so SB4D also got really specific about this tenure, and it added some things that were not in the previous 10-year reserve studies. So the structural integrity study actually added some things to it. So you're going to see the list right here. They're going to be looking at the roof. They're going to be looking at the load-bearing walls, the primary structural member. So just every component of the building that they think somehow holds up the building or supports its structure. We have floor, foundation. So this is a new one, and this is a big one. So we have buildings that are close to the water that already are seeing sea level rise into their lower floors in their garages. So this foundation thing is going to be really expensive for some of these buildings. Now, most of the buildings are already addressing it, but you're going to have buildings that haven't been addressing these issues and that also haven't been collecting full reserves based on their previous 10-year reserve studies. So those are the buildings that we're concerned with. And we're also, we're not just here to bash the buildings. We're also here, like if you own a condo and you're living in your condo and you're on a fixed income and you really can't afford maybe a 30-40% increase in your condo dues plus assessments for all of this work, then, you know, that's something, maybe it's time that you move to a property that is 2 stories, 1 story, or maybe in a different area of Florida. And then same thing, if you're buying a condominium, you also want to look at those things and see, okay, what have they done already? What work have they done? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we have fireproofing and fire protection systems. Now, if some of you know, ELSS is already taking care of some of that. So hopefully, I think the requirement is all the ELSS, emergency life safety systems. That law was 4 or 5 years ago, and all of those are supposed to be finished or at least started by 2023. And then they're going to look at plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing, and exterior painting. Anybody close to the coastline knows we're always doing concrete restoration and painting, and that's about every 8 to 10 years. And then windows, which windows could get tricky with, there's a lot of condos that the owners are responsible for impact windows or changing the windows, but now they're saying that the windows are part of the envelope of the building and the waterproofing. So I think there's going to be some conflict with current bylaws in some condominiums because the communities might all decide that, like the state may say that you have to replace all the windows and repair all the windows. That may be part of the engineer's findings, and then the bylaws for the condominium are going to say, well, it's not their responsibility. So you're going to see a lot of that sort of stuff changing, I believe. Of course, that's more like a property management attorney. They can answer like how all of that would work. And then mechanical systems. All right. So does anyone have any questions so far? You don't have to, if you have questions, we can answer some questions right now. And of course, we'll answer some questions at the end. And if anything comes up in the chat, you guys just let me know. I can't see the chat with my screen open like this. All right, so we'll move on to the, oh, I see some, oh, got it. Okay. All right, so this is what people want to really know the answer to, and there's no way to know exactly how much somebody's reserves are going to increase or how much the assessments are going to be. But what we do know is that everybody's going to pay more, and they've probably already started. We're seeing assessments happen in condominiums all across the state. So they've already started assessing. They're assessing not only for deferred maintenance that they haven't had done, but they're also assessing for the reserves. So basically they know, and we'll go through this, is that starting January 1st, 2025, there will be no more votes on assessments for all of those major components. Before, in the past, like with Surfside, they kept trying to get the residents to vote for assessments for huge. Now, I'm not saying that was the cause, it was just one of the causes that they determined, but they kept trying to get the residents to vote for these huge assessments. I think the last assessment they tried to put through was $20 million or $21 million or something like that. The problem the state realized is that that shouldn't be a vote. If the work has to be done on major structural components, it shouldn't be a vote. You shouldn't have the option to vote to replace your roof or not. You shouldn't have the option to vote to repair a leak underneath a pool. So that shouldn't be an option. It should be automatic. And so SB4D, that's what it's going to do. It's going to hurt. It's going to get expensive for the next couple of years, but eventually our buildings are going to be safer. And in the end, it's just going to be safer overall. But it is going to be more expensive to own a condo and to operate a condo because of these things. But it's just like you're fully responsible for constantly maintaining your building, and there's no vote about it. So that's why we see that this is going to get expensive. And one of the reasons for that is because of, so remember when I said that the engineer is the one doing the 10-year reserve study? The guy with the license is doing the 10-year reserve study. Basically, it's called a structural integrity study, but it's the same thing. So they have to quantify now all of that work, where normally when you're in a building, you have a construction project that you need to do, you hire an engineer, the engineer comes, he calculates all the quantities of the work to be done, and then he puts the bid out to contractors. Well, now the engineers have to do that without putting the bid out to contractors. So there's what I think what you're going to see is overestimating, and this is a total guess on my part, but their license is on the line because they're telling the building what they have to collect for their budget and in their reserves. So what are they going to do? They're going to be more careful, and they're going to say, oh, well, a typical roof is, 200,000, anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000. Well, guess what? You're going to be probably getting that at 300,000 because they don't know if we're going to have supply chain issues or what it's going to cost in 5 years or what it's going to cost in 6 years. So they're trying to estimate what the future is going to be, and now they're doing it. This is a licensed engineer that's doing it. So, and then these are the law is calling them safety systems. So that puts a whole other level of culpability in there. And of course, this is legal stuff, and you should talk to attorneys and get their opinion. I am not an attorney. I'm just telling you from my experience, what I see and what I'm understanding. I have watched a lot of webinars put on by property management attorneys who are all saying all of the stuff that I'm saying right now. And I would say that you should go watch the same thing. All right, so first thing, when you're analyzing, I think what we have to do as realtors, as owners, as buyers, is we all just have to start having these conversations more and looking at condominiums a little bit deeper. So the first thing is, does it even affect your condominium? So if your condominium is 10 years old, well, then no, you could just you know, that's it. You're not going to worry about that. But you want to make sure they're on the right track. You want to make sure that they're, you know, collecting their full reserves, which now they won't have a choice. They will also have to do that. And that they're doing all the maintenance work and the things that they need to be doing, and they're keeping up with the property. If your property is 2 stories or lower, well, then this doesn't affect you. But it does affect all the other condos in the state that are 3 stories and above. And eventually those condos will be 25 years old and 30 years old also. So eventually this will affect them. So we have our 3+ stories and then 25 years. All right. So it's a lot of information. We're going to go into the Q&A. We are going to put a link in the chat if you want to talk to us directly, if you have some questions, and that's anybody. If you're a real estate agent and you just have more questions, like maybe you have a buyer right now looking at a property and you say, okay, how do I really analyze this property to see where they're at? And I can just give you, we have some resources like 5 questions that owners should be asking their boards right now to know if they've already done and if they're on the path or scheduled to do them. And then we also have resources to look at a condominium and say, okay, this is where we're at. We have X, Y, and Z. And, you know, they're already doing the work. One of the things that I think is important, and that's just because we have a limited amount of engineers, is do they already have work happening? Because if they already have work happening and they're doing concrete restoration and they're doing the windows and they're doing the balconies, which we're seeing a lot of down here, then that's actually a really good sign. It's a good sign because they probably already assessed for that. So it's not going to hit them really hard in their future budget. It's already existing. And then they have a relationship with an engineer. They have a relationship with an architect. They have a relationship with a contractor. So those relationships are going to be really critical in mid to late 2024 when everybody's scrambling, who's had their head in the sand. You know, those relationships are going to matter. So because those other people who don't have those relationships and haven't been doing the work and haven't been collecting full reserves, they're the ones who are going to suffer the most. And to end, like, I think the first question I asked myself when this law passed was, well, what happens to a building that hasn't been collecting reserves and hasn't been doing work? I mean, as realtors, we've done deals where they're like, oh, we need 6 months condo dues up front, because they don't really collect their reserves the way they should all the time. Well, worst case scenario, other than an actual collapse of a building because of the deferred maintenance, worst case scenario is the building, the association, the building fails. It is a nonprofit business and it fails as a business, and a developer comes in and buys it and builds something else. And I don't know how the owners at that time are compensated. If they are compensated, I would assume it would be minimally. I am hoping that doesn't happen to any condominium in the state of Florida, but I can't imagine with the sheer volume of condos that we have that it won't. I mean, there may be some few that it happens to. So yeah. So, you know, we'll put a link in the chat and you guys can connect with us at a later time. And if you have any questions now, I'll answer them. No. And you can unmute yourself. You should be able to unmute yourself, or I can unmute you. If you have a question, you can speak up if you don't feel like typing all of that in the chat. I guess we're good. All right, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Got what I needed. Thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.